The morning of October 26, 1942, aboard the USS Enterprise, somewhere in the waters north of the Santa Cruz Islands, Lieutenant Stanley Veitasa sat in the cockpit of his Grumman F-4F Wildcat, fury building in his chest like steam in a boiler. His hands gripped the control stick so hard his knuckles had gone white. Around him, other pilots of Fighting Squadron 10, the Grim Reapers, waited in their fighters, engines silent, while somewhere above the cloud deck, Japanese strike aircraft were already inbound. Every fibre of Veitasa's training screamed at him that they were doing this all wrong. Fighter pilots were supposed to launch early, climb high, position themselves with altitude and the sun at their backs. Instead, they sat on a steel deck, waiting. The fighter director's voice crackled over the radio, ordering them to hold position. Hold position! The words felt like acid in Veitasa's ears. He could see the other pilots in their cockpits, their faces masks, of barely controlled frustration. They all knew what was coming. The Japanese had been spotted over an hour ago. By now, enemy bombers and torpedo planes would be setting up their attack runs. And here sat America's defenders, trapped by indecision and poor planning, their propellers still. At 28 years old, Swede Veitasa, so nicknamed by his former squadron mates for his Scandinavian heritage, was no stranger to combat. He'd already earned 2 Navy Crosses. But this moment, this maddening delay, would haunt him for the rest of his life. Because when the order finally came to launch, it would already be too late to intercept with any real advantage. They would be scrambling to catch up, fighting from below, exactly where no fighter pilot ever wanted to be. What Veitasa couldn't know, as his anger simmered in that cramped cockpit, was that in less than 2 hours, he would perform one of the most extraordinary feats of aerial combat in the entire Pacific War. He would shoot down 7 Japanese aircraft in approximately 12 minutes, 5 of them in what witnesses would later describe as a display of flying and gunnery so precise, so audacious, that it seemed to defy the laws of probability itself. But the numbers don't tell the full story. They never do. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what happened that October morning, to grasp the full weight of Veitasa's achievement, we must first understand the man, the machine he flew, and the desperate strategic situation that had brought the American and Japanese fleets to this particular patch of ocean. Stanley Winfield Veitasa was born on July 27, 1914, on an isolated homestead in Montana, to parents of Czech and Norwegian descent. His was a childhood of hard work and vast horizons, where self-reliance wasn't a virtue, it was a necessity. The Montana landscape shaped him, austere, unforgiving, beautiful in its severity. These weren't qualities that made for easy social interactions or corporate ladder climbing, but they were exactly what naval aviation needed. He attended Montana State College before transferring to the University of Montana, but academia held little appeal for a young man whose eyes kept drifting toward the sky. In 1937, Veitasa enlisted in the Navy. 2 years later, on July 13, 1939, he earned his wings and was commissioned as an ensign. His first assignment sent him to Scouting Squadron 5 aboard the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown, where he would fly the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. The SBD Dauntless was not a fighter. It was a scout and dive bomber slower, less maneuverable, designed to carry a heavy bomb load and survive long overwater reconnaissance missions. But Veitasa flew it like a fighter, and that distinction would save his life. On May 7, 1942, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, Veitasa participated in the attack on the Japanese light carrier Shoho. It was a textbook dive-bombing mission. American aircraft swarmed the carrier, pressing home their attacks through murderous anti-aircraft fire. In less than 7 minutes, the Shoho was finished, the first Japanese carrier lost in the war. Veitasa's bomb found its mark. He earned his first Navy Cross for that action. But the next day brought something entirely different. On May 8th, Veitasa was flying anti-torpedo plane patrol near Yorktown when a swarm of Japanese Zeros descended on his flight. 8 Mitsubishi, a 6M-0 fighters against a handful of lumbering dive bombers. The Zero was the most feared fighter in the Pacific Light, incredibly maneuverable, capable of outturning and outclimbing virtually anything the Allies could field. American fighter pilots in purpose-built fighters struggled against the Zero. Veitasa was in a dive bomber. What happened next entered into squadron legend. Remembering his squadron commander's emphasis on aggressive maneuvering, Veitasa turned into every attack. He used his forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns, designed primarily for strafing ground targets to engage the Zeros. When the engagement ended, Veitasa claimed 3 kills. His plane was shot full of holes, but he made it back to Yorktown. Japanese records would later show no Zeros were actually lost in that engagement, but the Navy credited Veitasa with the victories and awarded him a second Navy Cross. The citation would note something remarkable. Veitasa was the only dive bomber pilot to earn the Navy Cross for aerial combat. Most received it for bombing runs. But Swede had done something different. He'd taken a scout plane into a dogfight and emerged victorious. That caught the attention of Lieutenant Commander James H. Flatley, one of the Navy's most experienced fighter leaders. Flatley was forming a new fighter squadron VF-10, the Grim Reapers, to fly the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. And he wanted Veitasa. The transfer came through. By October 1942, Veitasa was no longer a dive bomber pilot. He was a fighter pilot in the Grim Reapers, assigned to the USS Enterprise, and headed back into the crucible of the Solomon Islands campaign. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat was not the plane American naval aviators wanted. When war broke out, they knew they were outmatched by the Zero in almost every performance category. The Wildcat was slower, couldn't climb as fast, and couldn't turn as tightly. It was heavier, weighing in at approximately 2.5 tons, fully loaded, and had a range of just over 800 miles. Powered by a 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney radial engine, the F4F4 variant could manage 320 miles per hour straight and level. But the Wildcat had 3 critical advantages. First, it was rugged. The plane could absorb tremendous punishment and keep flying. Japanese pilots quickly learned that the sturdy American fighter didn't disintegrate after a few hits like their own aircraft. Second, it was heavily armed. The F4F4 carried 6.50 caliber machine guns in the wings, a devastating weight of fire if you could get it on target. And third, it had armor. Both the pilot and critical systems had protective plating that the Zero lacked entirely. In the Zero, Japanese designers had sacrificed protection for performance. In the Wildcat, Grumman had accepted reduced performance for survivability. This trade-off forced American pilots to develop new tactics. You couldn't dogfight a Zero and expect to win. Instead, pilots like Commander John Thach devised the Thach Weave, a tactical formation where 2 Wildcats would weave back and forth, each covering the other's tail. If a Zero latched onto one Wildcat, the second would cross in front of his partner, giving him a head-on shot at the attacker. It worked, but it required discipline, communication, and trust. Veitasa had joined VF-10 at a critical moment. The campaign for Guadalcanal, that miserable, jungle-covered island in the Solomon chain, had been raging since August. U.S. Marines had seized Henderson Field, the island's airstrip, in the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. But holding it was another matter. The Japanese were pouring reinforcements onto the island, launching attack after attack to retake the airfield. Control of Guadalcanal meant control of the Solomon Islands. Control of the Solomons meant control of the sea lanes to Australia. The entire Allied position in the South Pacific hinged on that one muddy airfield. And so the carriers came. In August, at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, American and Japanese carrier forces clashed, trading blows, damaging each other without a decisive result. Now, in late October, the Japanese were preparing another major push. They'd concentrated 20,000 troops on Guadalcanal for a massive offensive against Henderson Field, scheduled to begin on the night of October 23rd. To support this ground assault, the Imperial Japanese Navy sortied with its carrier fleet. The plan was simple: destroy the American carriers, cut off support to the Marines, and retake the island. On October 25th, American search planes spotted Japanese carriers to the northwest. Admiral William Halsey, Commander South Pacific, sent a characteristically blunt message to Rear Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, commanding Task Force 61. Strike, repeat, strike. But the situation was confusing. Kinkaid had two carriers, USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, but Enterprise was designated the duty carrier, responsible for providing search aircraft and combat air patrol. That left Hornet to launch the strike force, or it should have. Instead, in a decision that would later be scrutinized and criticized, Kinkaid ordered Enterprise to launch its own strike force, despite having an experienced, fully spotted strike group sitting on Hornet's deck. The Enterprise strike force was hastily assembled, inexperienced, and as Veitasa quickly calculated, almost certainly out of range. When the plan was briefed to VF-10, Swede didn't hide his feelings. "This is insane," he told anyone who would listen. The mission was impossible. They wouldn't make it to the target. And even if they did, they wouldn't make it back. His objections were noted and ignored. Orders were orders. At approximately 7:30 in the morning on October 26th, Veitasa and 7 other F-4F Wildcats from VF-10 launched from Enterprise to escort the strike force. Flatley, the squadron commander, wasn't leading them. He'd broken his foot in a deck accident and was hobbling around below decks, rigging his fighter's pedals to accommodate the injury. The man who should have been leading the fighter, Escort Lieutenant Commander William Killer Kane, the squadron. XO was also absent for reasons Veitasa never learned. So the 8 Wildcats went up, led by less experienced officers, on a mission Veitasa knew was doomed. He was right. The strike force flew their search legs to the northwest, hunting for the Japanese carriers. They found nothing. The intelligence was old. The Japanese had moved. Hours passed. Fuel gauges dropped toward empty. Finally, with no targets found and no choice remaining, the strike force turned for home. By the time they reached the calculated position where Enterprise should be point option, in Navy parlance, night had fallen, and Enterprise wasn't there. The carrier had moved during combat operations, chasing action. Now, in the darkness, dozens of American aircraft were running out of fuel over the open ocean, searching desperately for their ship. Some pilots ditched in the water, others headed south toward Espiritu Santo, hoping to reach land before their engines quit. Veitasa, drawing on every bit of his experience and that Montana-bred resourcefulness, remembered something. That morning, during the dawn combat air patrol, he'd noticed an oil slick trailing from Enterprise. The ship's engineers were working on a problem. Most pilots would have dismissed it as trivial. Veitasa filed it away. Now, in the dark, he descended and began searching for that slick. He found it. The oil sheen caught the moonlight, a faint trail on black water. Veitasa followed it, tracking back along Enterprise's path like a hunter reading a trail sign. Hours after launching, nearly out of fuel, he found his carrier and landed safely. His squadron mates straggled in behind him. Not all of them made it. This was the same night before the battle. Veitasa had just survived a pointless, exhausting mission that accomplished nothing except to drain fuel and nerves. His commanding officer was injured. The ship's crew was exhausted. And everyone knew that tomorrow the Japanese would come in force. Veitasa managed a few hours of fitful sleep, then reported to the ready room for the morning brief. Intelligence confirmed multiple Japanese carriers to the northwest. Enterprise and Hornet would have to stop them. The problem was numbers. The Japanese had 4 carriers, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Junyo, and Zuiho, with approximately 200 aircraft among them. Many of their pilots were veterans with years of combat experience over China and throughout the opening months of the Pacific War. Against this force, the Americans could field 2 carriers with 136 aircraft total, and many of Enterprise's aircrews were fresh from stateside training. But Veitasa wasn't fresh. He was angry, angry at the waste of the previous day's mission, angry at the indecisive command decisions, angry at the Japanese for being out here at all. That anger, channeled through discipline and skill, would make him deadly. The morning of October 26th began badly and got worse. Japanese scout planes found the American carriers first. The enemy strike force launched at approximately 0740, a massive wave of aircraft. 64 planes, including 21 Aichi D-3A2 VAL dive bombers, 20 Nakajima B-5N-2 Kate torpedo bombers, and 21 A-6M0 fighters. Another strike wave would follow. Over 100 Japanese aircraft were coming. American fighters needed to launch immediately, climb to altitude, and position themselves to intercept. Instead, confusion reigned. Poor communication between Enterprise and her fighter directors, compounded by bad weather and clouds at altitude, delayed the launch. When the order finally came, it was already too late. The Japanese strike was almost overhead. Veitasa and his division himself, Lieutenant Leroy Tex Harris, Ensign Willis Chip Redding, and Ensign William Hank Leader finally got the signal. They launched into instrument conditions, the Enterprise deck barely visible through the murk. As they climbed through the clouds, they could already hear the anti-aircraft fire beginning. The Japanese were attacking through the weather, bombing blind, but bombing nonetheless. Enterprise shuddered under near misses and hits. The 4 Wildcats broke through the clouds at 10,000 feet. Below them, the battle was fully joined. VAL dive bombers were pulling out of their attacks on Hornet, several miles away. Veitasa could see the other carrier wreathed in smoke and flame. She'd been hit hard. Above and around them, Japanese and American aircraft tangled in swirling dogfights. Veitasa made a quick decision. 2 VALs were pulling out of their dives, having just attacked Hornet. They'd be slow, vulnerable, still recovering energy. He didn't ask permission. He rolled his Wildcat over and dove. The first VAL never saw him. Veitasa closed to within 200 feet, lined up his gun sight carefully, and pressed the trigger. 6.50 caliber guns roared. The combined weight of fire, approximately 4,000 rounds per minute, shredded the VAL's unarmored airframe. The Japanese dive bomber erupted in flames and spun into the ocean. Veitasa pulled hard, looking for the second VAL. There, climbing, trying to get back to altitude, he hauled the Wildcat around in a punishing turn, pulled lead, and fired. Another burst. The second VAL came apart, pieces spinning away from the main fuselage, 2 down. But there was no time to celebrate. Harris's voice came over the radio. "Second wave inbound! Kates! Enterprise!" Veitasa snapped his head around. There, approaching from the northwest, was a formation of Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, at least 11 of them, maybe more. And they were headed directly for Enterprise. The Kate was Japan's primary carrier-borne torpedo bomber, slower than the VAL dive bomber but carrying a deadly Type 91 aerial torpedo. Kates operated in carefully coordinated attacks. They would spread out, approaching a target from multiple angles, forcing the ship to choose which torpedoes to evade. A single torpedo could cripple a carrier. Multiple hits would sink her. The Enterprise was already damaged from the earlier attacks. She couldn't afford more hits. And between those, Kates and the carrier stood exactly 4 F-4F Wildcats. Veitasa, Harris, Redding, and Leader. 4 fighters against 11 bombers. The mathematics was brutal. Veitasa didn't hesitate. He pushed his throttle forward and dove toward the Kate formation. The Nakajima B-5N Kate was a reliable, well-designed torpedo bomber, but it was also slow and vulnerable. Maximum speed was approximately 200 to 35 miles per hour, fast enough to evade surface gunfire during an attack run, but hopelessly outmatched by fighters. The Kate's defensive armament consisted of a single rearward-firing 7.7mm machine gun operated by the radio man gunner in the rear cockpit. Against a fighter's 6.50 caliber guns, it was like bringing a pocket knife to a sword fight. But numbers mattered. 11 Kates against 4 Wildcats meant the Japanese held nearly a 3-to-1 advantage. And those Kates weren't just flying, they were executing a carefully choreographed attack. As Veitussa closed the distance, he could see them beginning to separate, spreading out to approach Enterprise from multiple angles. It was standard Japanese torpedo tactics, designed to overwhelm a ship's ability to maneuver. The carrier would have to choose which torpedoes to evade, and mathematics dictated that some would hit. Veitussa and Harris made a quick decision over the radio. They would attack from the side, using their superior speed to slash through the Kate formation before the bombers could set up their runs. No fancy tactics. No time for anything clever, just speed, violence, and accurate shooting. Veitussa selected the nearest Kate and closed rapidly. The Japanese rear gunner opened fire, tracers arcing through the space between the two aircraft. Veitussa ignored them. He'd been shot at before. At 300 yards, he opened fire himself. The Wildcat's 6 guns converged their fire at a point roughly 250 yards ahead, the optimal range for maximum destructive effect. Veitussa held the trigger down for a 2-second burst. Approximately 130 rounds tore into the Kate. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Kate's fuel tank, unprotected by self-sealing technology, ruptured. Gasoline vapor ignited. The entire aircraft became a ball of orange flame, the aluminum airframe melting in the 1500-degree heat. The Kate nosed over and plummeted toward the ocean, trailing a long plume of black smoke. Veitussa didn't watch it fall. He was already transitioning to the next target, using his speed advantage to overtake a 3-plane Kate formation that had just entered a cloud bank. The clouds were scattered cumulus, not thick enough to hide in, but enough to break visual contact. Veitussa followed them in, trusting his instruments, keeping his eyes locked on the spot where the Kates had disappeared. He emerged from the cloud mere seconds later. The 3 Kates were directly ahead, still in formation, completely unaware he was behind them. Veitussa closed on the trailing aircraft, got within 200 feet, and fired. Kate exploded. He shifted aim smoothly to the second aircraft. Another burst. The second Kate caught fire and fell away. The third Kate pilot, finally realizing what was happening, broke formation and tried to dive away. Veitussa followed him down, got his gunsight Piper on the fleeing bomber's engine cowling, and fired again. The Kate's engine seized, belching smoke, and the aircraft went into the ocean. 3 more Kates were destroyed in less than 60 seconds. Veitussa had now shot down 5 aircraft in approximately 3 minutes of sustained combat. His ammunition counters were dropping rapidly. The F4 carried 240 rounds per gun, for the outboard guns, and 400 rounds per gun. For the inboard guns, 1,500 rounds total. He'd already expended hundreds of rounds, but there were still more Kates. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Above and to his left, Veitussa spotted another Kate, this one at a higher altitude than the others. It appeared to be maneuvering to set up an attack run. Veitussa pulled his nose up, trading airspeed for altitude, and fired a burst at the target. He saw his tracers pass near the Kate, but couldn't confirm hits. The bomber dove away, disappearing into the clouds. Veitussa considered pursuing, but made a quick tactical decision. The Kate was too high to make an effective torpedo drop from that position. The anti-aircraft gunners on the ships below would handle it. He needed to save his ammunition for certain kills. He was right to conserve. As he turned back toward Enterprise, he saw Harris engaging more Kates off the carrier's port quarter. The formation had been broken. Several of the torpedo bombers had jettisoned their weapons and were fleeing, but the attack was still ongoing. Enterprise was maneuvering hard, her captain ordering full rudder turns to evade the incoming torpedoes. The carriers escorting destroyers and cruisers had joined in with their anti-aircraft fire, filling the sky with black puffs of exploding shells. Veitussa dove back into the fray. He saw a Kate lining up on Enterprise from astern, low and slow, the classic torpedo attack profile. He rolled, inverted, pulled through, and came down on Kate from above and behind. The Japanese rear gunner was firing, but his aim was wild. Veitasa centered the Kate in his gun sight, allowed for deflection, and squeezed the trigger. His guns were hammered. The Kate shuddered under the impacts, then exploded as one of Veitasa's rounds found the torpedo still attached under the fuselage. The blast was tremendous, the torpedo's warhead detonating sympathetically with the aircraft's fuel. Debris rained into the ocean. And then, suddenly, it was over. The remaining Kates had either dropped their torpedoes or fled. The sky around Enterprise, which moments before had been filled with attacking aircraft, was now empty except for the American fighters and the smoke trails of dying aircraft. Veitasa looked at his fuel gauge, critically low. His ammunition counters showed less than 20% remaining. His hands were shaking from adrenaline. He'd been in continuous combat for approximately 12 minutes. In that time, he had shot down 7 Japanese aircraft, 2 Aichi-D, 3 A-Val dive bombers, and 5 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers. Harris had destroyed 1 more Kate. Between them, they had single-handedly broken up an attack that could have sunk Enterprise. Below, the carrier was still afloat, still maneuvering. Captain Osborne Hardison, who had taken command of Enterprise just 5 days earlier, had expertly conned his ship through the attack. The carrier had dodged 9 torpedoes, 9 separate tracks of death that boiled past her hull without hitting. It was, by any measure, extraordinary seamanship. But without Veitasa and Harris destroying those Kates before they could coordinate their attack, no amount of maneuvering would have saved her. Veitasa circled once, checking his division. All 4 Wildcats were still flying. Reading and Leader had engaged other targets during the chaos. Everyone was low on fuel and ammunition. Time to land. But landing on a carrier that had just been attacked was its own challenge. Enterprise's flight deck had been damaged by bomb hits. Landing was hazardous. The ship's landing signal officer, Lieutenant Robin Lindsay, was one of the best in the Navy, and he proved it that day. One by one, he brought the combat air patrol aircraft aboard, threading the needle between battle damage and operational necessity. Veitasa was the last in the pattern. He watched as the aircraft ahead of him caught the arresting wire and rolled to a stop. The deck crew immediately pushed it forward, folding its wings manually, making room for the next plane. Then it was Veitasa's turn. He rolled into the groove, focused entirely on Lindsay's paddles. The landing signal officer gave him an early cut signal, drop it now, and Veitasa chopped his throttle. The Wildcat dropped onto the deck, the tailhook catching the rearmost arresting wire. He'd locked the deck. There was literally no more room ahead of him for additional aircraft. Several planes still aloft would have to ditch in the ocean or try for distant Espiritu Santo. Veitasa climbed out of his cockpit on shaking legs. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cool morning air. Deck crewmen swarmed his aircraft, refueling it, rearming it, and preparing it for another launch. There was no time for celebration or decompression. The battle wasn't over. And indeed it wasn't. Even as Veitasa was being debriefed, Japanese aircraft from the carrier Junyo were forming up for another attack. Water was scarce aboard the damaged Enterprise. The bomb hits had ruptured fresh water lines, but Veitasa got what he could and prepared to go back up. Approximately 45 minutes after landing, he was airborne again on combat air patrol. With Ensign Whitey Faitner as his wingman, Veitasa climbed back to altitude and resumed his vigil over the fleet. Less than an hour into this second patrol, another Japanese strike appeared on radar. 12 or more Kate torpedo bombers, this time approaching as high-altitude horizontal bombers rather than low-level torpedo attackers. Veitasa could see them clearly. They were in range. He could intercept. He called the fighter director, requesting permission to attack. The response came back. Negative. Hold your position. He called again, more insistently. The Kates were getting into an attack. Position. Can I detach 3 Cap F-4Fs for an interception? Negative. Veitasa watched, impotent with frustration, as the entire Japanese formation swept over the burning hulk of Hornet, dog-legged left, and disappeared. It was the same maddening indecision, the same command confusion that had plagued the battle from the beginning. Fighter directors on the ship, lacking a complete tactical picture, were making decisions that fighter pilots in the air could see were wrong. But orders were orders. The strike did not engage the American carriers that time, but more would come. Throughout the long afternoon of October 26th, Japanese aircraft from Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Junyo continued to attack. They pounded the crippled Hornet with bombs and torpedoes. The carrier's crew fought valiantly, keeping her afloat through multiple hits, but eventually the damage was too much. Late in the afternoon, Admiral Halsey ordered the Hornet abandoned. Destroyers attempted to scuttle her with torpedoes and gunfire, but the tough carrier refused to sink quickly. When Japanese surface forces were reported approaching, the destroyers had to withdraw, leaving Hornet's burning hulk behind. Japanese destroyers would finally finish her with torpedo hits early on the morning of October 27th. Enterprise, thanks in large part to Veitasa's intercept of the Kate Formation, survived. She withdrew south with her escorting ships, damaged but operational. She would fight on. Hornet was lost, but Enterprise endured, and with her, American hopes in the South Pacific endured as well. The Battle of Santa Cruz Islands was, by most tactical measures, a Japanese victory. They'd sunk an American fleet carrier and damaged the other. They'd lost no carriers of their own, though both Shokaku and Zueho had been badly damaged and would require months of repairs. By tonnage sunk, by ships damaged, by possession of the battlefield, the Japanese had won, but tactics are not strategy. Japan's problem was attrition. They'd lost 99 aircraft, and more critically, many of their most experienced aircrews. These were pilots and aircrew who had trained for years, who had combat experience stretching back to China in the 1930s. They were irreplaceable. American losses were 81 aircraft, but American training pipelines were producing new pilots by the hundreds every month. American shipyards were building new carriers, new aircraft, new everything. The Japanese had won the battle but were bleeding to death from their victories, and critically, they had failed in their strategic objective. The offensive to retake Henderson Field failed. The Marines held. Guadalcanal remained in American hands. The Japanese Navy, having suffered irreplaceable losses of experienced aviators, would never again have the same offensive capability. Some historians argue that Santa Cruz, not Midway, was the true turning point, the battle where Japanese naval aviation began its long, irreversible decline. Swede Veitasa's role in that outcome was significant. His squadron commander, James Flatley, recognized immediately what Veitasa had accomplished. In his after-action report, Flatley wrote that Veitasa's intercept of the Kate Formation had, in all likelihood, saved Enterprise from destruction. He recommended Veitasa for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation went up the chain of command to Rear Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, the task force commander. Kinkaid, whose questionable tactical decisions had contributed to the confused American performance during the battle, made a final, incomprehensible decision. He downgraded Flatley's Medal of Honor recommendation to a Distinguished Flying Cross. When Flatley learned of this, he was furious. He resubmitted the recommendation, this time for the Navy Cross. This one went through. Veitasa received his third Navy Cross for the action at Santa Cruz, his third in 7 months of combat. He became the only World War II carrier pilot to receive the Navy Cross for both dive bombing and aerial combat. But he never got the Medal of Honor. 70 years later, in 2012, an effort was made to upgrade Veitasa's Navy Cross to the Medal of Honor. The recommendation was reviewed and denied. The reasoning was never made entirely clear, though some speculated that the Navy was reluctant to reopen questions about Kinkaid's leadership at Santa Cruz. For his part, Veitasa never spoke much about the medals he didn't receive. He was more concerned with the 7 kills he was credited with that day, because he knew something that most historians wouldn't discover until decades later. His score was inflated. In the chaos of combat, with multiple fighters engaging multiple targets, accurate kill confirmation was nearly impossible. Pilots made claims based on what they saw, but in the heat of battle, memories were unreliable. 2 pilots might shoot at the same target and both claim the kill. An aircraft, might be seen trailing smoke and claimed as destroyed, only to limp home and land safely. The fog of war applied to aerial combat just as much as ground combat. After the war, when historians began cross-referencing American claims with Japanese records, a different picture emerged. The Japanese had lost fewer aircraft than the Americans claimed. Much fewer. At Santa Cruz, American pilots claimed to have shot down over 100 Japanese aircraft. Actual Japanese losses were 99 close, but still an overclaim. And when individual claims were examined, the overclaiming became even more apparent. Post-war analysis of Veitassa's claims at Santa Cruz concluded that he had shot down 4 aircraft, not 7, 2 Val dive bombers and 2 Kate torpedo bombers. 3 of his Kate claims could not be confirmed against Japanese loss records. This doesn't diminish his achievement. 4 kills in one day is still extraordinary, still qualifies him as an ace in a day. But it does highlight a common problem in combat aviation: the difference between what pilots believe they accomplished and what actually happened. Veitassa, to his credit, accepted these findings without bitterness. He understood the nature of aerial combat. He knew that in the chaos of that October morning, with smoke and clouds and multiple aircraft engaged, perfect accuracy was impossible. What mattered was that he had broken up the attack on Enterprise. The carrier survived. That was the mission. The exact number of kills was, in some ways, beside the point. He left VF 10 inches May 1943 and returned to the United States to serve as a flight instructor at Naval Air Station Atlantic City. His combat days were over. He'd proven himself in 2 very different aircraft, the SBD Dauntless and the F-4F Wildcat, and had been awarded 4 Navy Crosses, a near unprecedented achievement. But like many combat veterans, he found the transition to training duty difficult. The men he was teaching were heading into combat. He'd been there. He knew what they would face, and there was nothing more he could do to help them except teach them everything he knew. After the war, Veitassa remained in the Navy. He served aboard the USS Essex during the Korean War as the air officer responsible for all flight deck operations. It was a critical role, requiring absolute precision and an ability to make split-second decisions under pressure, exactly the skills he'd honed in combat. He commanded the ammunition ship USS Firedrake from July 1959 to August 1960, then achieved every naval aviator's dream: command of an aircraft carrier. From November 1962 to November 1963, Captain Stanley Veitassa commanded the USS Constellation, one of the Navy's newest and most capable carriers. But his time in command was marred by accidents. 3 incidents occurred on his watch: an aircraft lost, a deckhand severely injured, and several crew members killed in separate mishaps. Investigations cleared Veitassa of direct responsibility. Carrier operations are inherently dangerous, and accidents happen even with perfect leadership, but the incidents stalled his career. The same aggressive, outspoken personality that had made him a brilliant fighter pilot made him a problematic officer in peacetime. He clashed with superiors. He spoke his mind when silence would have served his career better. He retired on July 1, 1970, as a captain, never having achieved flag rank. For a man with his combat record, with his achievements, retirement at 06 was seen by many as a profound injustice. But Veitassa never complained publicly. He'd served for 33 years. He'd done his duty. That was enough. He settled into civilian life, working for 25 years as the secretary of the Ray River Ranch Corporation. He married, raised children, and lived quietly. The warrior became a businessman, a grandfather, an ordinary citizen. The transformation that millions of veterans made in the post-war years. But Swede Veitassa was never quite ordinary. In the 1980s and 90s, as World War II history became a subject of renewed public interest, historians and aviation enthusiasts began seeking out surviving aces. Veitassa, who had remained largely out of the spotlight, was rediscovered. In 1987, he was inducted into the Carrier Aviation Hall of Fame. Suddenly, People wanted to hear his stories. Veittasa told them. Not with boasting or embellishment, but with the straightforward honesty of a Montana rancher's son. He described the chaos of combat, the fear, the anger, the split-second decisions that meant the difference between survival and death. He talked about the friends who didn't come back, the mistakes commanders made, the missions that shouldn't have been flown. He was, as always, outspoken. In 2010, author Ted Edwards contacted Veittasa about writing his biography. Veittasa was 96 years old by then, but his memory of combat remained sharp. Over the next 2 years, Edwards conducted multiple in-person interviews, dozens of phone conversations, reviewing specific details and clarifying ambiguities. The result was 7 at Santa Cruz. The Life of Fighter Ace Stanley Swede Veittasa, published in 2018. The book revealed something that few historians had fully appreciated, just how close the American position in the South Pacific had been to collapse in October 1942. Guadalcanal was hanging by a thread. The Marines were exhausted, undersupplied, racked by disease. Henderson Field was under constant attack. If the Japanese had succeeded in sinking the Enterprise at Santa Cruz, if they'd achieved command of the sea around the Solomons, the entire campaign might have unraveled. Veittasa's intercept of those Kate torpedo bombers wasn't just a personal achievement, it was a strategic act. By preventing the Enterprise from being sunk or crippled, he helped preserve American naval power in the region at the exact moment when it could least afford losses. The carrier would go on to fight in virtually every major engagement of the Pacific War, earning 20 battle stars by war's end, more than any other U.S. warship. She survived the war and became a symbol of American resilience. The historians who researched Santa Cruz discovered something else interesting. The Japanese pilots who attacked Enterprise that day had been among their most experienced. Many had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. They knew what they were doing, and yet, not because of American technological superiority, the Japanese aircraft were, in many ways, superior to their American counterparts. Not because of numbers, the Japanese had more aircraft. They failed because individual Americans like Veittasa refused to let them succeed. There's a tendency in modern warfare analysis to focus on technology, on systems, on grand strategy. We talk about radar and code breaking and industrial capacity. All of these mattered. But in October 1942, the deciding factor was simpler. A 28-year-old fighter pilot from Montana who flew his Wildcat into a formation of enemy bombers and shot them down one by one, refusing to break off even when outnumbered, because his ship was behind him and there was nowhere else to go. Stanley Swede Veittasa died on January 23, 2013, at the age of 98. He was cremated and, in accordance with his wishes, his ashes were scattered at sea, returned to the element where he'd fought, where he'd saved his ship, where so many of his comrades had died. The ocean off the Solomon Islands keeps its dead. The Hornet lies there still, in 3 miles of water. So do hundreds of aircraft, American and Japanese. So do thousands of sailors and airmen who never made it home. But Veittasa did make it home. He lived a long life, saw his country win the war he'd fought in, raised a family, retired with honor. In the grand sweep of World War II history, with its millions of casualties and globe-spanning campaigns, the story of one fighter pilot shooting down 4 or 7, as he was credited enemy aircraft, might seem small. A footnote. One day out of 6 years of war. But that's not how history actually works. History is made of these moments, individual decisions, individual acts of courage, individual refusals to accept defeat. Eisenhower didn't personally storm the beaches at Normandy. MacArthur didn't personally retake the Philippines. Wars are won by the men who pull the triggers, drop the bombs, man the guns, by the pilots who fly into overwhelming odds because their ship is behind them and someone has to. The title, How One Fighter Pilot's Suicidal Head-On Pass Shot Down 7 Zeros in 12 Minutes, takes certain liberties with the historical facts. Veittasa didn't shoot down Zeros, he shot down Vals and Kates, which were bomber aircraft, not fighters. The confirmed number was 4, not 7, though he was credited with 7 at the time. And while his attacks were certainly aggressive, they weren't suicidal. They were calculated risks made by an experienced pilot who understood his aircraft's capabilities and limitations. But the title captures something true: the sheer audacity of what Veitasa did. 4 American fighters against 11 enemy bombers. Any sane tactical analysis would suggest avoiding engagement, staying high, letting the ship's anti-aircraft guns handle the threat. But Veitasa didn't avoid engagement. He attacked. He closed to point-blank range, expended his ammunition without hesitation, and broke up an attack that would have sunk his carrier. That requires a particular kind of courage. Not the courage of ignorance. Veitasa knew exactly how dangerous it was. Not the courage of desperation. He could have disengaged. It was the courage of commitment, the recognition that this was the moment, this was the task, and there was no one else to do it. In the decades after the war, military analysts studied the Battle of Santa Cruz intensively. They examined the tactical errors, the communication failures, the missed opportunities. They debated whether Kinkaid should have launched Enterprise's strike force, whether the combat air patrol was positioned correctly, whether the Japanese could have pressed their advantage more effectively. Entire books were written about command decisions and strategic implications. But the analysis that mattered most was simpler. Enterprise survived because Swede Veitasa shot down 4 enemy torpedo bombers before they could coordinate their attack. Everything else, the grand strategy, the logistics, the intelligence, all of it, came down to that moment. 1 pilot, 1 aircraft, 12 minutes. The F-4F Wildcat that Veitasa flew that day, Bureau No. 19, served throughout the rest of the war. After Santa Cruz, it returned to combat, flown by other pilots, in other battles. It survived the war, a rare achievement for carrier aircraft, which typically were lost to combat, accidents, or simple wear and tear. After the war, like most military aircraft, it was surplused and scrapped. The aluminum was probably recycled, melted down, reused. The machine that had saved Enterprise no longer exists, but its story remains. In museums, you can see other Wildcats, preserved and restored, painted in wartime colors. They sit silent behind velvet ropes, surrounded by placards explaining their specifications and combat records. Children tap on the plexiglass, parents read the descriptions, and everyone moves on to the next exhibit. The aircraft become artifacts, relics of a vanished time. What gets lost in that process is the terror. The Wildcat wasn't a museum piece on October 26, 1942. It was a howling, shaking, vibrating machine screaming through tropical burrs, air at 300 miles per hour, its engine roaring, its guns hammering, while tracers arced through the sky and enemy aircraft exploded, and the ocean rushed up from below, and the whole world contracted down to the gun sight and the target, and nothing else mattered except putting rounds on target before the crumbs. Target put rounds on you. Veitasa experienced that. Not once, but dozens of times across his combat career. And each time, he climbed back into the cockpit and did it again. That's the reality that museum displays can't capture. The visceral, terrifying, exhilarating, exhausting reality of combat. In his later years, Veitasa was asked frequently about his combat experiences. Interviewers wanted to know what it felt like to shoot down an enemy aircraft, to be an ace, to receive the Navy Cross. Veitasa's answers were often frustratingly brief. "It was our job," he'd say. Or, "We did what we were trained to do." He deflected praise, redirected credit to his squadron mates, emphasized the team effort. But occasionally, usually late in an interview when he'd relaxed, he'd say something more revealing. He'd talk about the friends who didn't come back from missions. The pilots who landed in the ocean were never found. The aircrew who were killed on deck by Japanese bombs. He'd note, almost casually, that his survival was as much luck as skill. A few feet different on any of a dozen occasions, and he'd have been the one who didn't come home. This is the paradox of military heroism. Those who survive often feel guilty for surviving, while those who died are remembered as heroes. Veitasa shot down 4 aircraft and saved his carrier. But pilots with equal skill and courage went into the ocean that day and were never seen again. Were they less heroic or just less lucky? The question has no satisfactory answer. War is chaos. Survival is statistical. Heroism and death are not oppositely correlated. Some of the bravest die first. Some of the luckiest live without ever being tested. The only certainty is that those who survive carry the memories of those who don't. Veitasa carried those memories for 70 years after Santa Cruz. He attended squadron reunions, corresponded with fellow veterans, remembered the faces and names of men who'd died when he was in his 20s. The boy from Montana who'd wanted to fly became a man who'd seen too much, done too much, survived too much. But he endured, he adapted, he lived. And that, perhaps, is the real story. Not the 12 minutes of combat on October 26, 1942. Not the 4 confirmed kills or the 7 credited. Not the Navy crosses or the command tours or the Carrier Hall of Fame. The real story is that Stanley Veitasa flew into combat when his country needed him, performed extraordinarily when the moment demanded it, and then returned to ordinary life and lived it with the same quiet competence he'd brought to combat. There are no monuments to Swede Veitasa. No ships named after him. No airports or military bases bearing his name. He exists in military records, in history books, in specialized aviation museums. He is known to enthusiasts, historians, and students of naval aviation. But, to the wider world, he's unknown. And perhaps he would have preferred it that way. He never sought fame. He did his job, led his men, fought his battles, and went home. The Montana homestead where he was born no longer exists. The carriers he served on were all scrapped. The aircraft he flew are gone. Even the ocean where he fought has healed, leaving no trace of the battles fought upon it. But the consequences of what he did remain. The Enterprise survived. Guadalcanal held. The Solomon Islands campaign succeeded. The Allied advance across the Pacific continued. Japan's naval aviation never recovered from the losses sustained at Santa Cruz and subsequent battles. The war was won, and while no single pilot, no single action, no single battle won the war, each was a necessary link in the chain of events that led to victory. Veitasa was one link in that chain, a Montana farm boy who learned to fly, who fought with skill and courage, who saved his ship when it mattered most. The world he helped create, the world of American power projection, of carrier battle groups, of security and prosperity built on sacrifice, that world owes him a debt it can never fully repay and barely remembers it owes. On January 23, 2013, when Stanley Veitasa died, the Navy issued a brief press release noting his passing. A few newspapers ran obituaries. Aviation magazines published remembrances. And then the world moved on, as it always does, to newer stories, fresher headlines, current events. But history remembers. In the archives, in the records, in the after-action reports from October 1942, Veitasa's achievement is documented. Future historians, studying the Pacific War, will encounter his name and his story. They'll debate the exact number of kills, analyze his tactics, and place his actions in the broader strategic context. And some of them, perhaps, will understand what was truly at stake that morning off the Santa Cruz Islands. It wasn't just aircraft shot down or torpedoes evaded. It was the survival of American naval power at the moment when it was most vulnerable. It was the preservation of hope for the Marines on Guadalcanal. It was proof that individual courage and skill still mattered in an age of industrial warfare. It was a reminder that wars are won by people, not machines. Stanley Swede Veitasa provided that reminder. 12 minutes of combat, 4 aircraft destroyed, 1 carrier was saved, a lifetime of quiet dignity afterward. That was his contribution, that was his legacy. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.